What he did next left the entire construction site speechless. The first warning came as a sound so small that almost nobody heard it. A soft metallic click. Then another. Then the entire concrete platform beneath 32 construction workers shifted less than an inch. Most of them froze. One man did not. Before anyone could shout his name, Daniel Reyes dropped his tool belt, ran toward the unstable edge of the 34th floor, and did something so unexpected that every machine on the construction site seemed to fall silent. But to understand why Daniel made that choice, you have to understand the kind of man everyone believed he was. To most people at the site, Daniel was almost invisible. He was 47 years old, of average height, with broad shoulders worn down by years of lifting materials heavier than he should have carried alone. His work boots were scratched white from concrete dust. The knees of his faded jeans were patched with darker fabric, and his yellow safety vest had been washed so many times that it looked almost gray. Every morning, Daniel arrived at the Riverside Tower construction site at 5:35. Not 5:34. Not 5:36. Always 5:35. The security guard at the gate, an older man named Leonard, used to joke that the company could set its clocks by Daniel's arrival. Daniel would tap his access card against the reader, nod politely, and walk toward the temporary changing rooms while the city was still hidden beneath the blue darkness before sunrise. He never complained about the cold. He never complained about the heat. He never joined the younger workers who stood beside the coffee truck criticizing supervisors, wages, weather, traffic, or life in general. He simply opened the dented metal thermos his daughter had given him years earlier, poured black coffee into its plastic cap, and studied the day's work schedule. Daniel was a concrete finisher. It was a job that looked simple only to people who had never done it. When wet concrete arrived through the pump hose, it came alive like a gray, heavy river. It had to be guided, spread, leveled, compacted, and smoothed before it began to harden. Too much water weakened it. Too little made it difficult to work. A few careless minutes could ruin a section of flooring that had taken weeks to prepare. Daniel understood concrete the way a musician understood rhythm. He knew its mood from the way it dropped from the hose. He could tell whether a mixture was too wet by watching the stones settle beneath the surface. He could feel, through the handle of a screed, whether the material had filled every corner around the reinforcing steel. Concrete remembers every mistake. He often told new workers, "You might cover it today, but one day it will show you exactly where you were careless." Most of the younger men laughed when he said things like that. They called him Professor Concrete. Daniel did not mind. He showed them how to stand so the vibration from the machinery did not damage their wrists. He reminded them to secure loose cables. He checked their harnesses when they pretended not to notice. He had no official authority. He was not a foreman, an engineer, or a safety officer. He was simply a laborer who had spent 26 years learning that construction sites punished people who believed experience made them untouchable. The Riverside Tower was the biggest project Daniel had ever worked on. When completed, it would be a 48-story glass building containing offices, apartments, restaurants, and a hotel overlooking the river. At street level, enormous cranes turned slowly above the site. Concrete trucks waited in lines beside temporary barriers. Steel bars rose from unfinished floors like the ribs of a giant animal. The air smelled of wet cement, diesel exhaust, hot metal, and rain trapped inside plywood. More than 200 people worked there during the busiest shifts. Electricians threaded cables through walls. Welders sent showers of sparks into the shadows. Carpenters constructed molds for columns and floors. Crane operators lifted materials hundreds of feet above the street, while signal workers guided them with precise hand movements. The site was loud from sunrise until evening. Reversing alarms beeped constantly. Generators growled. Hammers struck steel. Radios cracked with instructions. Yet Daniel moved through all of it with a calm that made him seem detached from the noise. He had learned that calmness was not the absence of fear. It was the ability to hear the important sound hidden beneath everything else. That Thursday morning began like hundreds of others. The crew was preparing to pour a large section of the 34th floor. The area was supported by temporary steel props and wooden formwork installed beneath the floor slab. Hundreds of reinforcing bars had been tied together in a grid. Electrical conduits and drainage sleeves had been placed between them. Once the concrete pour began, there would be no easy way to stop halfway. The weather report predicted heavy rain by late afternoon, so management wanted the work completed quickly. At 6:10, the site's superintendent, Victor Hale, gathered the crew near the material hoist. Victor was a tall, sharp-faced man who always seemed to be fighting an invisible clock. He had joined the project 6 months earlier after the original superintendent resigned. The tower had already fallen behind schedule. Every delayed day cost the company thousands of dollars. Victor carried that knowledge like a weight on his back. "We're pouring the entire east section today," he announced. "The first trucks arrive at 7. The pump starts at 7:15. Once we begin, we keep moving. No unnecessary stops." Daniel raised his eyes from the floor plan. "How much of the lower bracing was inspected yesterday?" he asked. Victor looked at him. "All of it. By the structural team? By the people responsible for inspections." Daniel glanced toward the stairwell leading to the floor below. "I saw carpenters replacing several props near grid 8 yesterday afternoon." Victor's expression hardened. "And they finished. I didn't see the new connections marked." The workers around them became quiet. Victor disliked being questioned publicly, especially by someone without a title. "The formwork supervisor signed the sheet," Victor said. "The engineer released the pour. That is all you need to know." Daniel studied him for a moment. "All right." Victor stepped closer. "Is there a problem?" "Not if it was inspected." "It was." Daniel nodded and returned to the plan. The meeting ended, but the conversation did not disappear. As the workers collected equipment, a young laborer named Eric leaned toward Daniel. "You enjoy making powerful people angry?" Daniel clipped a tape measure onto his belt. "No, you're good at it. I'm better at staying alive." Eric grinned, thinking it was another one of Daniel's serious jokes. At 24, Eric Morgan was one of the youngest workers on the concrete crew. He had been at the site for only 3 weeks. He was strong, energetic, and eager to prove that he belonged. He also had a habit of rushing. Daniel had already stopped him twice from walking beneath suspended loads and once from stepping backward near an unprotected opening. Eric considered safety instructions an obstacle between himself and respect. Daniel considered that attitude the fastest way to be carried off a construction site on a stretcher. At 6:42, Daniel walked down one level to inspect the support system beneath the planned pour. Temporary lights hung from electrical cords, casting long shadows across the unfinished floor. Rows of steel props extended from the concrete below to the plywood deck overhead. Horizontal braces connected many of them. The support system appeared dense and orderly from a distance. Up close, Daniel noticed small irregularities. A base plate near column 18 was resting partly on a broken piece of plywood instead of directly on a stable surface. 2 braces had fresh silver bolts, suggesting recent replacement. A diagonal support carried a thin scrape that looked new. Daniel crouched beside it and placed his fingers against the metal. He could feel no movement. Still, something bothered him. Looking for ghosts. Daniel turned. Marcus Bell, the formwork foreman, stood behind him with rolled drawings beneath one arm. Marcus was a heavy man with a red beard and a permanent expression of exhaustion. "I'm looking at yesterday's repair," Daniel said. "It's finished." "Why was the section changed?" "One of the braces bent when material was moved." "How badly?" "Not badly." "Was the load redistributed before the replacement?" Marcus sighed. "Yes." "Who checked it?" "I did." "Did the engineer see it?" Marcus's jaw tightened. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm asking a question." "You're a finisher, Daniel." "Finish concrete." Daniel stood slowly. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Marcus finally looked away. "We are already late," he said more quietly. "Victor wants that slab poured before the storm. Schedules don't hold buildings up." "No, but schedules keep people employed." Daniel looked again at the replacement brace. "Until they don't." At 7:15, the concrete pump came to life. The long black hose shook as the first mixture traveled upward through the pipeline. A worker directed the end toward the prepared slab, while others spread the concrete using rakes and shovels. The crew moved efficiently. Daniel guided the screed across the wet surface, removing excess material and filling low areas. Concrete splattered against his boots. The machine vibrated through his arms and shoulders. By 8 o'clock, the first section was complete. By 9, nearly a quarter of the eastern deck had been covered. The sky outside turned darker. Wind pushed sheets of dust through the open sides of the building. Plastic coverings snapped against temporary railings. Victor moved constantly around the floor, checking progress and speaking into his radio. Keep that hose moving. Bring the next truck forward. We need more people at the south edge. No breaks until the next section is finished. The pressure spread through the crew. People moved faster. Tools were dropped and left where they fell. Cables crossed walking paths. Workers stepped around open spaces without looking down. Daniel noticed everything. He pulled one cable away from a puddle. He replaced a missing guardrail pin. He stopped Eric from lifting a concrete vibrator by its electrical cord. "You're not my father," Eric said, irritated. "No. Then stop watching me like I'm a child." Daniel wiped concrete from his gloves. "When you stop moving like one, I will." Eric stared at him. Several nearby workers laughed. Eric's face reddened, and he walked away without responding. It was the first conflict of the day, small enough to be forgotten. The second arrived 40 minutes later. A delivery truck carrying reinforcing mesh became stuck in the muddy entrance below. The delay blocked 2 concrete mixers from reaching the pump. The flow of concrete slowed, threatening to create a cold joint where fresh concrete met material that had already begun setting. Victor exploded over the radio. "Get that truck moved now." The pump operator reduced the pressure. Workers stood waiting while the unfinished edge of the pour began losing moisture. Daniel knelt beside it and pressed a gloved finger against the surface. "We need bonding slurry if this sits much longer," he told the foreman. Victor overheard him. "It won't sit. It already is. The trucks are moving. We should prepare for the possibility." Victor stepped toward him. "Every time something happens, you act as if the building is about to collapse. I act as if concrete follows physical laws instead of schedules. This isn't your decision." "No, but it will be someone's repair." Victor looked around and saw workers listening. His voice became lower and colder. "Do your job, Daniel." Daniel held his gaze. Then he nodded. The block truck was finally freed, and the concrete flow resumed. The crew worked aggressively to connect the new material to the old edge before the difference became permanent. By 11:30, their clothes were soaked with sweat despite the cold wind. They ate lunch in a temporary sheltered area near the central core. Most workers sat on overturned buckets or piles of lumber. Daniel opened a small container of rice, beans, and grilled chicken. Eric sat several feet away, scrolling through his phone. After a while, he looked at Daniel. "Why do you care so much?" he asked. Daniel continued eating. "About what?" "Every bolt, every cable, every person wearing a harness wrong. Because they matter. To you, they should matter to everyone." Eric put his phone down. "You act like you own the place." Daniel smiled faintly. "No, owners usually care about different things." A few workers chuckled. Eric did not. "I need this job," he said. "I can't keep stopping every 5 minutes because something isn't perfect." Safe doesn't mean perfect. Easy for you to say. You've been doing this forever. Daniel closed the lid of his container. "That is why I'm saying it." Eric glanced away. "My girlfriend is pregnant." Daniel's expression softened. "How far?" 7 months. "Your first child?" Eric nodded. "A girl. Then you have a reason to slow down." "I have a reason to earn overtime." "You can do both." Victor says the people who work fastest get kept when the project slows down. Daniel looked across the floor toward Victor, who was eating while studying a schedule. "Fast workers are replaceable," Daniel said. "Reliable workers are not." Eric did not answer. The lunch break ended after 20 minutes. When they returned to the slab, the wind had strengthened. Dark clouds crowded the horizon, and distant thunder moved over the river. The third conflict began at 12:36. Daniel was operating the power trowel near the completed section when he felt an unusual vibration beneath his feet. It lasted less than 2 seconds. He stopped the machine. The floor appeared stable. Workers continued spreading concrete 30 feet away. Daniel crouched and placed one hand against the hardened surface. Nothing. He restarted the trowel. The vibration returned. This time he heard a faint tapping beneath the slab. Daniel switched off the machine and walked quickly toward Marcus. "Something is moving below grid 8. Marcus did not look up from his radio. "The pump causes vibration. This is different. There are 200 machines on this site. I know what the pump feels like." Marcus finally looked at him. "What exactly did you feel?" "A repeated movement. Possibly a loose prop." Marcus stared toward the area. "The supports were checked. Let's check again. We cannot inspect beneath an active pour without stopping the crew." "Then stop the crew." Marcus laughed once, without humor. You want me to stop a full concrete operation because you felt a vibration? Yes. Victor approached them. What is happening? Marcus rubbed his forehead. Daniel thinks he felt movement. Where? Grid 8, Daniel said. Victor looked at the wet concrete, then at the sky. Rain had begun to strike the open edge of the building in scattered drops. The formwork passed. Inspection, Victor said. Something changed. Based on what? My feet. Victor stared at him. Your feet. Yes. We have poured more than 100 cubic yards today. That increases the reason to check. If we stop now, we lose the slab. If the supports are moving, the slab is already in danger. Victor took a slow breath. I need evidence. Daniel pointed toward the stairwell. Give me 5 minutes downstairs. No, why? Because you are assigned here, and the area below has restricted access during the pour. Then send Marcus. Marcus shook his head. I have a crew to supervise. Daniel looked from one man to the other. Rain began falling harder, tapping on hard hats and darkening the concrete surface. Victor spoke firmly. Return to work. Daniel did not move. Return to your station or leave the site. Several workers nearby had stopped what they were doing. Daniel looked at them, then toward the wide gray slab beneath their boots. His instincts told him to refuse. But instincts were not evidence, and refusing meant losing the job that paid for his mortgage, his daughter's college tuition, and his wife's medication. He thought of the unopened hospital bills inside a kitchen drawer at home. He thought of his daughter, Sophia, who had called the previous night to say she might need help paying for her final semester. He thought of how difficult it was for a 47-year-old laborer to find another union job in the middle of a project season. Daniel lowered his eyes. Then he returned to the power trowel. For the next 20 minutes, nothing happened. He began wondering whether Victor had been right. Perhaps the vibration had come from the pump line. Perhaps fatigue had made Daniel too sensitive to ordinary movement. Then, at 1:02, a carpenter named Jonah approached him. Daniel. Something in Jonah's face made him switch off the trowel immediately. What? I went down to get a drill. And I heard metal popping near grid 8. How many times? 3. Maybe 4. Did you see anything? It was dark, but one of the props looked tilted. Daniel dropped the trowel handle. He found Marcus near the concrete hose. Jonah heard movement. Downstairs. Marcus turned sharply toward Jonah. You entered the restricted area? I needed a drill. Did you touch anything? No. Did you actually see a failed support? Jonah hesitated. No. Marcus looked at Daniel. There is still no evidence. Daniel stepped close enough that Marcus could hear him over the machinery. If a prop is tilting, the load is moving to the others. Marcus's face changed. Only slightly. But Daniel saw it. You knew, Daniel said. Marcus looked away. What? You knew there was a problem? No. Why did you replace those braces yesterday? I told you. You told me one bent. What bent it? Marcus said nothing. Daniel's voice became quieter. What happened? Marcus glanced around to ensure Victor was not beside them. A pallet of blocks was placed on the deck before the supports were complete. How heavy? I don't know. You know? About 4,000 pounds. Daniel felt cold despite the sweat inside his clothes. Where? Near grid 8. Did the deck deflect? Barely. How much? Maybe half an inch. And Victor still approved the pour? The pallet was removed. We replaced the damaged braces. Did the structural engineer inspect it? Marcus did not answer. Daniel understood. You signed the inspection. Victor said the repair followed the engineer's standard detail. But the engineer did not see it. We were already 2 days behind. Daniel stared at him. You need to stop the pour. Marcus's eyes were wet with anger or fear. If I admit this now, I'm finished. If you don't, someone else might be. You don't understand. I understand exactly. My wife lost her job. My son needs surgery. Victor said if we reported another delay, the company would replace the entire formwork subcontractor. Daniel looked toward the workers standing on the slab. 32 people were in the active area. Some were young. Some were fathers and mothers. Some had been arguing about weekend plans only minutes earlier. You made a mistake, Daniel said. You still have time not to make the next one. Marcus shook his head. It's probably fine. Metal clicked beneath them. Both men stopped breathing. It was a small sound, almost gentle. Then came another. Daniel felt the platform shift less than an inch. A bucket of water nearby formed a ripple. Marcus stared at it. Daniel grabbed his radio. Stop the pump. Everyone off the east deck. Victor's voice answered immediately. Who gave that order? Possible support movement at grid 8. Evacuate the slab. Daniel, release the radio. The concrete hose continued pumping. Workers looked around uncertainly. Daniel shouted with everything in his lungs. Move. Get to the core. Now. Some workers obeyed instantly. Others hesitated, looking toward their supervisors. Victor pushed through the crew. Do not panic. The deck is stable. A louder crack came from below. The plywood beneath the reinforcing steel sank visibly near the center of the pour. Only half an inch. But this time everyone saw it. The construction site erupted. Workers dropped tools and ran toward the reinforced concrete core at the center of the building. The pump operator shut down the flow. The heavy hose twisted across the wet slab. Do not run, Daniel shouted. Spread out. Move toward the core. Running together could concentrate weight on one section. Some workers understood. Others did not. Fear took control of their legs. The deck groaned beneath them. Daniel moved against the flow, heading toward the unstable area instead of away from it. That was when he saw Eric. The young man had been operating a concrete vibrator near the open eastern edge. During the evacuation, the twisting pump hose had struck a stack of reinforcing mesh. The mesh fell sideways, trapping Eric's right leg against a low steel bar. He pulled desperately, but could not free himself. Everyone else was moving toward safety. Eric was moving nowhere. Daniel, he screamed. Daniel ran toward him. Victor caught Daniel's arm. Leave him. The rescue team is coming. There is no time. You'll add weight to the failure zone. Daniel tore his arm free. The slab dropped again. Wet concrete flowed toward the depression like thick water draining into a basin. Daniel stepped onto the reinforcing grid, spreading his weight carefully across the steel. Each movement pushed concrete over the tops of his boots. Eric grabbed the fallen mesh with both hands. I can't move it. Stop pulling, Daniel said. The floor is falling. Look at me. Eric's breathing came in short, uncontrolled bursts. Look at me, Eric. The young man raised his eyes. Your leg is pinned at the ankle. Pulling backward tightens it. Turn your body toward the river and bend your knee. Eric tried. Pain crossed his face. I can't. You can. Another metallic pop sounded below them. A section of plywood separated from a beam, creating a dark line beneath the concrete. Daniel grabbed the mesh. It was too heavy to lift directly. He looked around. The nearest tools had been abandoned several yards away. A steel concrete rake lay partly submerged beside the hose. Daniel reached for it, positioned its handle beneath the mesh, and used the steel bar as a lever. On 3, he said. When it rises, turn your foot sideways. Eric nodded. 1. The slab trembled. 2. A sharp crack echoed through the floor. 3. Daniel pushed down on the handle. The mesh lifted 2 inches. Eric twisted his body and pulled. His boot came free, but the movement threw him backward. He landed near the open edge, where temporary railing had been removed to allow materials to enter. Half his body slid beyond the slab. Daniel released the lever and lunged. He caught Eric's safety harness at the back. Eric hung over the side of the 34th floor, kicking against empty air. His lanyard was clipped to his belt, but not to an anchor point. Daniel had warned him about it that morning. Now the unconnected hook swung uselessly beside his body. Don't let go, Eric shouted. Daniel lay face down in wet concrete, gripping the harness with both hands. Below them, the city looked impossibly distant. Cars moved like small pieces on a board. The wind pulled at Eric's clothes. Daniel tried to drag him upward, but his boots slipped through the wet mixture. He could not gain leverage. Behind them, workers shouted from the safe zone. A safety officer began moving toward them with a rescue rope, but Victor stopped him. The center section is failing. The distance between Daniel and the stable core was nearly 40 feet. The deck dipped again. Concrete surged around Daniel's chest. He tightened his grip. Eric's face had turned pale. I'm sorry, he said. Save your breath. I should have listened. You can apologize later. I'm going to fall. No, my harness is slipping. Daniel looked at the stitching near Eric's shoulder. The strap had been damaged. One side was beginning to tear. Daniel could hold the harness, but the harness might not hold Eric. He needed another attachment point. His eyes moved to his own lanyard, clipped securely to the back of his harness. The retractable line extended to an approved anchor several yards behind him. It could support a falling worker. but only if connected properly. Daniel could not reach Eric's rear attachment ring without releasing one hand. He glanced at the dark gaps spreading through the slab. There was no time to think carefully, so Daniel did what no one expected. He unclipped his own harness. Workers in the safe area began shouting. "What is he doing? Daniel, stop!" He pulled one arm free, then the other, while continuing to hold Eric with his left hand. The safety harness slid from Daniel's body, but its lanyard remained connected to the anchor point. With one hand, Daniel lowered the harness toward Eric. "Put your arm through." "What?" "Put your arm through the strap." "I can't reach it." Daniel leaned farther over the edge. His chest moved beyond the slab. There was nothing securing him now. Only the friction of his body against the wet concrete and the strength left in his legs kept him from following Eric over the side. "Reach!" Daniel shouted. Eric lifted one hand from the damaged harness and pushed it through Daniel's harness. The other arm. "I'll fall. I have you." The stitching on Eric's original harness tore another inch. Eric forced his second arm through. "Pull it over your shoulders." Eric struggled until Daniel's harness was wrapped around his upper body. It was not fitted correctly, but it created a second point of support. Daniel grabbed the loose chest strap and connected it. The retractable lanyard tightened. For 1 second, both men remained suspended between safety and disaster. Then the center of the deck failed. The sound was not an explosion. It was deeper, a crushing roar of wood, steel, and concrete collapsing together. The slab around Grid 8 folded downward. Wet concrete disappeared through the opening. Reinforcing bars bent like wire. Tools, buckets, and loose materials fell to the floor below. The failure moved rapidly toward Daniel. "Pull the line!" Victor screamed. Workers near the core grabbed the retractable lanyard and rescue rope. Eric rose several feet as the line tightened around Daniel's harness. Daniel had no harness of his own. The concrete beneath his knees cracked. A section of plywood dropped away. His body slid toward the opening. Eric reached down. "Take my hand." Daniel grabbed it. For a moment, Eric was supported by the harness, and Daniel was supported by Eric. The remaining crew pulled. The line retracted slowly. Eric's body reached the edge. 2 safety workers crawled forward from the stable zone and grabbed his shoulders. Daniel continued hanging below him, one hand locked around Eric's wrist. "Don't let him go," someone shouted. Eric screamed as the damaged strap cut into his chest. Workers pulled him backward inch by inch. Daniel struck the side of the broken slab. His fingers began slipping. Eric looked down at him. "I can't hold you." "Yes, you can." "My arm. Look at me." Eric's eyes met his. "You're going home to your daughter," Daniel said. Then Daniel used his free hand to push against the broken edge. The movement lifted his body just enough for one of the safety workers to grab his jacket. Another seized his belt. Together, they dragged him across the jagged concrete as the last section behind him disappeared into the floor below. When Daniel finally reached stable ground, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The concrete pump had stopped. The generators seemed distant. Even the rain had softened. 32 workers stood across the floor, staring at Daniel Reyes lying on his back without a harness, his clothes soaked in gray concrete, his hands bleeding from cuts caused by steel and broken plywood. Eric lay beside him, still wrapped inside Daniel's safety equipment. Daniel turned his head. "You all right?" Eric began crying. Not loudly. The tears simply moved across his face and disappeared into the concrete dust near his ears. Daniel closed his eyes. Only then did the entire construction site understand what he had done. He had given away the one piece of equipment designed to save his own life. Paramedics arrived within minutes. The building was evacuated while structural engineers assessed the failure. Eric had a fractured ankle, 2 cracked ribs, and severe bruising from the harness, but he was alive. Daniel had a dislocated shoulder, deep cuts on both hands, and a fractured wrist. He refused pain medication until the paramedics confirmed that no one had been trapped beneath the collapsed deck. The floor below had been cleared because of the restricted access rule. It was the only safety procedure that had worked exactly as intended that day. As Daniel was placed on a stretcher, Victor stood nearby, his face colorless. "I should have listened," he said. Daniel looked at him. "Yes." Victor seemed surprised by the answer. Daniel did not offer comfort. Some truths were too expensive to soften. The investigation began that afternoon. Work on the entire project stopped. Inspectors photographed the collapsed deck, examined the steel props, reviewed load calculations, and collected every inspection form associated with the pour. The findings were clear. The pallet placed on the deck the previous day had overloaded an incompletely braced section. 2 props had shifted at their bases. Several damaged braces had been replaced, but the plywood and supporting beams above them had not been thoroughly examined. One beam had developed a crack near a connection point. As concrete accumulated on the deck, the damaged beam transferred increasing weight to the surrounding supports. One prop, resting partly on broken plywood, tilted under the load. The failures then spread from one support to the next. The collapse had not been unpredictable. It had been preventable. Marcus admitted that he had signed the inspection sheet without requesting a new engineering review. Victor admitted that he knew the repair had been completed under schedule pressure and approved the pour without independent confirmation. Both men were removed from the project. The company faced penalties, lawsuits, and months of delay. News reporters gathered outside the construction gate for several days. They asked workers about the collapse and about the unnamed laborer who had rescued a colleague. Daniel refused every interview. He spent 4 days in the hospital and 6 weeks recovering at home. During that time, Eric visited him 3 times. The first visit was uncomfortable. Eric arrived carrying flowers and a bag containing Daniel's cleaned thermos, which had been recovered from the site trailer. Daniel's wife, Elena, welcomed him inside. Their home was small but warm. Family photographs covered one wall. A wooden cross hung above the kitchen door. Medical bills sat in a neat stack on the counter despite Daniel's efforts to hide them. Eric noticed them. He also noticed the pill organizer beside Elena's chair and the oxygen machine near the bedroom hallway. He understood then why Daniel had hesitated before challenging Victor. Daniel needed the job as much as anyone, perhaps more. Yet when the floor shifted, he had risked everything. Eric sat across from Daniel, whose wrist remained inside a cast. "I don't know what to say," Eric began. "Then don't say anything yet." Eric looked down. "You almost died because of me." Daniel adjusted the sling around his shoulder. "No, I almost died because several people made bad decisions. I didn't connect my lanyard. That was one of them." Eric swallowed. "I thought you were trying to embarrass me. I was trying to send you home alive." "I know that now." Daniel leaned back. "Knowing afterward is expensive." Eric's eyes filled with tears. "I keep dreaming about the edge. That will happen for a while." "Do you?" "Do I what?" "Dream about it." Daniel looked toward the window. "Sometimes." Eric rubbed his hands together. "My daughter was born 2 weeks early." Daniel turned back to him. "She's okay. She's healthy. Small, but healthy." "What is her name?" "Grace." Daniel smiled. "That's a good name." Eric reached inside his jacket and removed a photograph. It showed a tiny sleeping baby wrapped in a pink blanket. Daniel studied it carefully. "She has your nose." "Poor kid." They both laughed. Eric's expression then became serious. "I want you to have something." He placed an envelope on the table. Daniel did not touch it. "What is that?" "Some of the crew collected money." "No, Daniel, no, you've been out of work. We know about the medical bills." Daniel looked toward the kitchen, where Elena had quietly turned away. "I did not save you for money." "I know." "Then take it back." Eric pushed the envelope closer. "It isn't payment." "What is it?" "A reminder that you're not invisible." Daniel stared at the envelope. For years, he had arrived early, stayed late, fixed small mistakes, checked other people's equipment, and spoken when silence would have been easier. Most days, nobody thanked him. Most days, nobody noticed. He had convinced himself that this did not matter. But when he looked at Eric, he realized that being unseen and being unimportant were not the same thing. Daniel finally placed his hand over the envelope. "Tell everyone thank you." "I will." Eric visited again 2 weeks later, bringing Grace with him. Daniel held the baby carefully in his uninjured arm. She opened her eyes for only a second before falling asleep against his chest. Elena took a photograph. That image later became more important than anyone could have known. When Daniel returned to the Riverside Tower, the project looked different. The collapsed section had been removed. New supports had been designed and installed. Independent engineers were required to approve every major concrete pour. Workers attended additional safety training. A large whiteboard stood beside the entrance. Across the top, in red letters, it read, "No deadline is more important than a life." Daniel stopped in front of it. Leonard, the security guard, stood beside the gate. "About time they wrote that down," Leonard said. Daniel nodded. Writing is the easy part. As he entered the site, conversation stopped. Workers turned toward him. Some removed their gloves. Others stepped away from their equipment. Daniel felt uncomfortable beneath their attention. He had expected a few handshakes. Instead, more than 200 workers lined the path between the entrance and the central building. Eric stood at the front, now walking with only a slight limp. Beside him was a man Daniel had never met, the company's regional director. The director stepped forward. Mr. Reyes, we would like to recognize. Daniel raised one hand. No speeches. The director paused. A few workers smiled. Daniel looked at the rows of faces. What happened here was not heroic, he said. It was necessary. No one spoke. A worker was trapped. People helped him. That is what should happen. He glanced toward the repaired floor above them. But it should never have reached that point. Several people saw warning signs. Some were afraid of losing money. Some were afraid of losing their positions. Some thought the problem belonged to somebody else. Marcus was not present. Victor was not present. But Daniel was not speaking only about them. We all like to believe courage happens during the emergency, he continued. Sometimes it does. But most of the time, courage is needed much earlier. He looked at the younger workers. It is needed when a supervisor tells you to ignore something unsafe. He looked at the foreman. It is needed when admitting a mistake might cost you money. He looked at the managers. It is needed when protecting people threatens a deadline. Then he looked at Eric. And it is needed when someone corrects you, and your pride wants to stop you from listening. Eric lowered his head. Daniel's voice softened. A harness saved a life that day. But equipment is only the final protection. The first protection is one person caring enough to speak, and another person being wise enough to listen. For several seconds, the site remained completely silent. Then someone began clapping. Another worker joined. Within moments, applause filled the construction site and echoed against the unfinished concrete walls. Daniel looked down, embarrassed. That was the version of the story reported by newspapers and shared online. A humble worker returned to the site. His colleagues honored him. Management changed its safety policies. A young father went home to meet his newborn daughter. It would have been a satisfying ending, but it was not the whole truth. 3 months after the accident, Daniel received a letter from the hospital. He assumed it concerned another bill. Instead, it contained test results from the scans performed after his fall. Doctors had discovered a small mass near his left kidney. Because it was found early, it could be removed before spreading. Daniel read the letter twice. Then he sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the wall. He had felt healthy. He had returned to work. He had no symptoms beyond the normal pain of a laborer approaching 50. Without the accident, he would never have been scanned. Without the scan, the cancer might not have been discovered until it was far more dangerous. Daniel underwent surgery that winter. The doctors removed the tumor successfully. His recovery lasted several months, but his prognosis was excellent. When Eric heard the news, he drove straight to Daniel's home. "You saved my life," Eric said, sitting beside him. Daniel smiled weakly from the couch. "Apparently, you returned the favor." Eric shook his head. "I didn't do anything. You got stuck." That's a strange way to save someone. Life is strange. Eric looked toward the photograph of Grace sleeping in Daniel's arms. Elena had framed it and placed it on the shelf. What if the floor had never failed? Eric asked. Daniel considered the question. Then I might not know I was sick. And if you hadn't come back for me, you would not be sitting here. Eric stared at the floor. So the worst day of our lives was still the worst day of our lives, Daniel interrupted. Do not turn it into something beautiful just because some good came afterward. Eric looked at him. Daniel continued. People were injured. Careers ended. Families were frightened. We should not pretend pain is good. Then what are we supposed to believe? That good people can decide what pain becomes. Eric remained quiet. Daniel looked toward the window, where winter light rested across the small yard. We do not control every collapse, he said. We control whether we leave someone beneath it. 2 years later, Riverside Tower finally opened. The repaired 34th floor became part of a hotel restaurant. Overlooking the river, guests walked across polished stone without knowing how close that space had come to becoming a grave. Daniel never returned to full-time concrete work after his surgery. The company offered him a position as a safety trainer. At first, he refused. He did not like offices, presentations, or speaking in front of groups. But Eric convinced him. You spent your entire career teaching people who pretended not to listen, he said. Now they'll have to. Daniel accepted the job. He traveled to construction sites across the region, teaching workers how to identify formwork failures, how to question incomplete inspections, and how to respond during structural emergencies. He brought damaged equipment to his classes. Among those items was Eric's torn safety harness. Daniel would hold it in front of the room and allow the workers to examine the ripped stitching. This harness did not fail because it was poorly manufactured, he would say. It failed because it was damaged and not removed from service. Then he would place his own harness on the table, the one he had lowered over the edge. This one saved a man because it was inspected, anchored, and available when needed. Finally, he would show them a copy of the false inspection sheet signed before the collapse. This piece of paper nearly killed him. The room would become quiet. Tools matter, Daniel would say. Training matters. Rules matter. But honesty is also safety equipment. He never described himself as a hero. Whenever someone used the word, Daniel corrected them. A hero appears once, he said. A responsible worker appears every morning. Eric eventually became a safety coordinator. His daughter Grace grew up knowing Daniel as Uncle Danny. On her 5th birthday, she asked why her father always became emotional when Daniel entered the room. Eric knelt beside her and told her a simple version of the story. Before you were born, I was working very high above the ground. I made a mistake, and Uncle Danny helped me come home. Grace looked at Daniel. Were you scared? Daniel nodded. Very. But you still helped him? Yes. Why? Daniel looked at Eric, then at the little girl whose life could so easily have begun without a father. Because being scared tells you there is danger, he said. It does not tell you what kind of person to be. Grace seemed to think about this. Then she wrapped her arms around Daniel's waist. Years passed, but workers continued telling the story. Details sometimes changed. Some said Daniel had jumped across a collapsing gap. Others said he had held Eric with one hand for several minutes. A few made the fall seem higher, the collapse larger, and the rescue more impossible than it had actually been. Daniel disliked those versions. The truth was powerful enough. He was not unusually strong. He was not fearless. He did not know for certain that his plan would work. He was a tired, middle-aged laborer with unpaid bills, a sick wife, an injured shoulder, and every reason to protect himself. He simply saw another human being in danger and refused to calculate whether that life was worth the risk. That was what left the construction site speechless. Not that Daniel ignored fear. Not that he possessed extraordinary strength. Not even that he removed his own harness. It was the realization that the quietest person on the site had been carrying something more valuable than authority. He had been carrying responsibility. And responsibility, when tested, had become courage. Buildings rise because thousands of pieces support one another. A beam carries a slab. A column carries a beam. A foundation carries everything above it. When one connection fails, the pressure moves somewhere else. Human lives are not so different. Every day, someone near us is carrying more than we can see. A coworker is hiding fear behind irritation. A supervisor is making choices under pressure. A young worker is pretending to understand because he is ashamed to ask for help. A family is depending on someone to return home. We may never stand on a collapsing floor 34 stories above the ground. We may never be asked to surrender the one thing protecting our own life. But smaller moments of courage arrive constantly. They arrive when we notice a danger others ignore. When we tell the truth even though silence is safer. When we admit a mistake before it becomes a disaster. When we correct someone not to embarrass them, but to protect them. When we listen despite our pride. And when another person begins to fall, courage asks one simple question. Will we turn towards safety alone, or will we reach back? Daniel Reyes reached back. One young father returned home. One child grew up knowing him. One hidden illness was discovered in time. And an entire construction site learned a lesson that no safety manual could teach. Sometimes the strongest person is not the one who can carry the greatest weight. It is the one who refuses to let another human being carry it alone.